Welcome to the top 10 teachings of the Daf. We are going to be learning the 42nd page of Gemara Brachos today. And I wanted to first say words of chizuk and a tribute on the sad occasion of the loss of one of the Gadol Hador, Rav Dovid Feinstein, who passed away, I guess, right before Shabbos on Friday, and was buried today, this morning. And I wanted to mention that this, the end of the daf today, and the beginning of 43, daf 43, has a story about Rav when he passed away. And on the way back from his funeral, as the people who attended the funeral decided to stop somewhere and eat, and they weren't sure about whether or not they should make the brachot together as a group, one person like leading the benching for all of them. And they realized that without their teacher, without Rav, they didn't even know the laws of exactly how to make berachot hamazon. And sometimes we think that we need the Gadol Hador for the most important questions, such as what Dovid Feinstein would often be known for. He had great respect amongst the medical community because he understood both the science and the Torah and the halacha to be able to help people with the most important and delicate questions in their most severe illness, end-of-life issues. Very, very complex, challenging, and life and death questions. He was able to answer these questions. One of the handful of people in the United States who could really help in the most complicated situations, like things that, God forbid, should never happen, choices that we should never have to make. So he was one of the great poskim of our generation, following in the footsteps of his father, Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was the Gadol Hador and the posek Hador for who knows how many generations, because he continues to be the posek Hador even in this generation. Rav Moshe's psak is still outstanding on another caliber, another level. We can't compare anyone in the halachic world to what Rav Moshe revolutionized so much and was such an amazing, towering figure. And his son continued in his way. But besides for these most important life and death questions, even the day-to-day things, the brachos that we make, Rav Dovid, like his father Rav Moshe, would be there with infinite patience to guide people. And the Gemara itself says a little bit earlier that what should one do? The brachos may sometimes be a little complicated. We might not know which bracha, what to do. And the Gemara gives very concrete advice. Go to a chacham to learn, which means sometimes we don't want to encounter the Gadol Hador just when we're making a phone call from the emergency room. We want to be able to do that, God forbid, if we need to, but we also want to be able to learn how to make a bracha, how to bless God. And today we're missing that. We're missing our Gadol Hador, Dovid Feinstein, Hagoan, Dovid Feinstein. May we learn a little more Torah, maybe guided by the guidance of the Feinstein family that continues, Rabbi Tendler, Rabbi Mordechai Tendler, Moshe Tendler, and Rabbi Reuven Feinstein, of course, and the children of Rav Dovid, and the Feinstein family has Baruch Hashem, amazing. It's an amazing family. They're really just continue to be the ones that guide us here in America, and really maybe even more than America, in how to understand halacha. And I am personally a beneficiary of Rav Moshe's psak through his family, particularly through Rav Mordechai Tendler, but the whole family really is dedicated to understanding the Dvar Hashem Zu Halacha, to understand what it is and to guide us. And the rest of the family that remains should have Arichas Yadam B'Shalom Taivis and continue to guide Klal Yisrael in Derech Hashem, in the way of Hashem. We'll now continue with the top 10 teachings of Brachos, Daf Ben Beis. The first, number one, is why is wine so special? It's actually, the Gemara tells us a little bit about why wine is so special. The truth is, most people don't know this. If you're having a meal and you're drinking wine, a lot of people only have wine on Shabbos, and they don't realize that during the week you'd have to make a bracha even during the meal. Even if you made hamotzi and you're sitting down, let's say, to dinner, and you don't make any other brachas during the meal because they're all covered by hamotzi with the exception of dessert. And the Gemara talks about some other possible exceptions, but for practical purposes here in the US of A, it's just dessert that you'd have to make another bracha on. The whole meal is covered by the hamotzi, but guess what? The wine is not covered. On Shabbos, it's different. You already made hagafen for Kiddush, so it's covered by the hagafen of Kiddush. But during the week, it's not covered. A lot of people don't know that, so that's the first thing. When you're sitting down, even if it's a sudas mitzvah, it's a chasna, it's a bar mitzvah. I don't know if a bar mitzvah there's a sudas mitzvah. It's a bris, whatever it is. You washed and they serve wine. You got to make a hagafen, even though you had hamotzi, even though you washed for a bread and you had bread. So the question is, why not? If anything, wine is part and parcel of a good meal, a really high-level meal, especially if you're having company. The Gemara talks about how great a household that shares its wine. They don't just give the cheap wine to the guests. They give the good wine, and they're not stingy with it. They let it pour. It's a beautiful thing when you share. Wine, again, is dangerous if you drink too much and you become an alcoholic. But in the right company, in the right way, could be a beautiful thing. Of course, I'm saying you always have to have a dedicated driver. You shouldn't get too intoxicated, even if you have a dedicated driver, unless it's Purim, and even then you have to be careful. But within reason, within, it's a beautiful thing. So why is it not covered by the hamotzi? That's the Gemara's question. And the Gemara answers, this is the beginning of Daf Ben Beis Amud Aleph. Shani Yayin, here's the Gorem Bracha La'atzmo. Wine is different because wine causes its own bracha. Rashi explains, it's a beautiful Rashi, and it's Rashi L'Shita, so this is Rashi says some variation of this at least 3 times. Bikama mikomos huba. Wine comes at many occasions. He doesn't say what those occasions are here, but in other places he mentions, I believe, Kiddush. I don't know if he mentions Havdalah. He might not mention Havdalah. He mentions the bracha that we make for the Sheva brachos that we make over wine. And let's think of what other things we have a cup of wine. When we do the bracha for a new child at a bris that we named the baby, we make it over a cup of wine. We make a hagafen in the course of that. The Sheva brachos, both under the chuppah and as well as during the week, sometimes less, depending on the details of the marriage. After the wedding, that also has a cup of wine. What else is a cup of wine? Kiddush we mentioned, also Havdalah. There's Kiddush not just on Friday nights, but there's also a lesser Kiddush, which is called the greater Kiddush, Kiddush Rabbah, Shabbos day. What else has wine? Okay, there's the 4 cups of wine on Pesach, so it's not just Kiddush. Birchas Hamazon needs wine, at least should have wine. definitely when you have 10, even when you have 3, you should really be making the berachos hamazon over wine. Some people even make berachos hamazon over a cup of wine, even on their own. Okay, it's a little extreme, but it does exist. I had a Rosh Yeshiva who said, I will pay personally for the wine if you'll make sure that when they're benching in the yeshiva, this is in Los Angeles or Be'ezer Shachat, that you'll make berachos hamazon over wine. He was very makbid. If there is 10 people, we'd often make zimun with 10 people during the week, or 3 people. He said you could even do it on your own, but definitely 3 people, you should always be makbid to have wine. Of course, nobody cared. On a Tuesday night, even if they had guys making zimun, they didn't take. I didn't take the Rosh Yeshiva up and buy wine and make sure that we made berachos hamazon over wine. But you should. Okay, we were kids, we were in yeshiva. We didn't want to have to be bothered. But the bottom line is, all of these things have wine. And let me get to the punchline here. I'm getting sidetracked with how much wine, how many sacred rituals have wine in them. And so Rashi says, in all of those instances that I just outlined, you make a bracha on the wine, even though you don't need to drink it. You're not really interested in drinking the wine. At let's say, I was just at a wedding, right? And you give the chassan and kala the wine, and some people want to use red wine. You could imagine the disaster that would cause on a white dress of the bride. Totally terrible. You don't have to use red wine. The bride asked that we have white wine, and white wine was used, and that's the safer way to go. But the fact is, if you're fasting and it's your wedding, you're probably not really looking towards that kind of whatever wine they're serving. It's usually not a very good wine under the chuppah. It's like the last thing anybody thinks about is which wine should we get. Nobody puts any thought into that or any effort. And yet you're drinking the wine. Why? Because it's a bracha. I mentioned Sheva brachos. Much more important than Sheva. Sheva brachos is great. You need to do Sheva brachos. But you're still married without the Sheva brachos. You should do it. It's not right to get married without the Sheva brachos. But you are not married without the berachos erisin, the blessing on the erisin or the kedushin, which also needs wine. So that's the first cup of wine that the chassan and kala have, and then afterwards, the second cup of the wine is on the shava brachos under the chuppah, and then the third cup is in the shava brachos at the berachos hamazon. So there's 3 mitzvah cups of wine. You think the chassan and kala want to have more wine? They're fasting and they want to have 2. They don't want it. It doesn't matter. They want to get married. They want the marriage to be sanctified. They want the marriage to be blessed with the shava brachos. They want the second shava brachos in the berachos hamazon to be recited. They want to continue all week. And in order for that to happen, you need to have wine. In order to drink the wine, you have to make a bracha, which means that if you think about it, what is wine? What makes wine special? That it's kovea a bracha le'atzmo, which means it in and of itself becomes part of a mitzvah. In fact, there's a brisker chakira. If somebody didn't hear the bracha of Hagafen in, let's say, the Kiddush Friday night, somebody started talking to them and they couldn't hear the person making Kiddush make the bracha of Hagafen. How do you look at that bracha? Is it part of Birchas Hanenin, the bracha on benefiting from something, drinking? And therefore, it doesn't matter for the shomea, for the listener. They really have to fulfill their obligation for the Birchas HaMitzvot, the blessing on sanctifying Shabbos. That's what Kiddush is. So even if they didn't hear the bracha of Hagafen, or some of the briskers say no. The Hagafen, there's a diak in the Rambam, I think they're fine for this. Hagafen is part of Kiddush in this Rashi here. Let's go on brachot la'atzmo, which reminds me of the Torah that my good friend and excellent winemaker, Benjamin Kentz, he should bless him that this wine this year should somehow come out well, even though most of the wine was damaged by smoke. He was able to salvage some of it that wasn't damaged, and hopefully he was supposed to make a trip over the mountain to get wine from Southern California. Hopefully he did that trip, and his wine will be amazing for 2020. But like everything else in 2020, Napa, Santa Cruz County, those fires really impacted them. So they should have all the wineries, and I know certain people working in Northern California, whether it's what's it called again? Hagafen, I think, is okay. I'm thinking of the other place that's in Berkeley and has their wine sourced in Napa and Sonoma. Should also be okay. Covenant. Anyway, and of course Herzog, who also has vineyards in Napa. So we hope that we have good wine this year. Because why? Because we want to enjoy the wine. Of course we want to, but we also want to connect the wine to a mitzvah. It becomes part of a mitzvah, and because it becomes part of a mitzvah, Zok the Heilige Rashi, it's Kovea Brachot Atzmo, because of its significance, and therefore it's so significant that it's not covered by the hamotzi that we make. It's a very important thing. There's other Rishonim that have another answer about that wine is unique amongst liquids, that it gets an upgrade, unlike everything else, with the possible limited exception of oil, olive oil. Everything else, it's a downgrade. It's ha'etz, it's ha'adama when it's in the fruit or vegetable form, and then you juice it, it turns into a shahakal, which is more generic, more kolel, more inclusive, but less specific. Specific is better. If I could say something specifically about you, it's better than just saying general about all or a group, right? So the bracha is the same thing. So since Goren bracha la'atzma means it, and according to this other opinion, is that it's more specific, uniquely so, amongst liquids, with the limited exception again of the olive oil, and therefore, because of that, it should also be made its own bracha even during the course of a meal. Except again on Shabbos and Yom Tov when you're already made kiddush. Okay, that's number one. Number two is pizza, cake, crackers, shmorgasborg, bkisnin. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Gemara. I'm noticing the Gemara here, a lot of the bracha talk goes on around weddings. I also notice another thing is that a lot of times it talks about the rabbi or rabbis specifically preparing or getting involved in the preparation of the seudah, of the wedding party for their son. So it's just a reminder of how practical the rabbis were with all of their head in the clouds, ivory tower, all the details of the Talmud, that the Mishnah that they had to remember by heart. They still were very practical. They had to take care of their sons and their daughters, and they had to marry them off, and they had to prepare the wedding. They had to deal with the caterer. They may not have been caterers. They may have to talk to the town people and get this one to bake the cake, and the other one to make the challah, and the other one to shech the animals that they were going to eat, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the stories. Well, actually, that is one of the stories. But before that, the Gemara says, Rav Huna achal tlesa rifte b'nei tlasa b'kava. Rav Huna ate, I think he ate 13 of these mizonos breads. I don't know exactly what they were, but they're called bkisnin breads, and that's what we're going to talk about. And there were 3 to a kav, so there's a lot of them, below berach, and he didn't make a bracha. Most of the Rishonim say is, well, not most, but a number of the Rishonim say that what he didn't do is he didn't make a birchas hamazon. He didn't treat it like bread. And the Gemara says, Rav Nachman in particular says, I mean, you ate a lot. Presumably you were hungry. And And even if you weren't, kol she'achem kovin alav suda tzarech levarech. You don't necessarily go about making a bracha based on your own individual sense of satisfaction for how much you ate. You look at you look at the general population. Other people would consider this a meal. You ate a huge amount, so there's no reason why on Pasuk bkisnin you should have made a berachos hamazon, because what it is we call it mizonos bread, and we're going to talk about what this Pasuk bkisnin is. And now let's tell the next story, because this is what I told you, talking about weddings. So this is the story of Rabbi Yehuda. He was arranging for the marriage of his son to the daughter of Rabbi Yehuda bar Chaviva. And that's what we're talking about, the importance of getting married. And when you're getting married, it's a good time to pay attention to what the rabbis are doing when they're eating, in terms of what bracha they make before and after, what it is that they eat. And you learn a lot. So next time you're at a simcha and there's rabbis around, make sure you pay attention to what's going on. You might learn something. And the rabbis always were learning things at weddings. So this is one of those stories. So they brought this bread from bkisnin. I know you're all dying of suspense to find out what is bkisnin bread. I don't want to say I'm going to promise you, but bli neder, I'm going to tell you. So just hold your horses. So they bring this bkisnin bread, and Rabbi Yehuda came and he heard them making what sounded like hamotzi, and he sarcastically said, "What is this tzitzi sound that I'm hearing? Are you guys saying hamotzi on this subpar bread? It's not really bread." And they said, "Yes, because we heard a ruling is like Rabbi Mona that says you do say hamotzi on Pasuk bkisnin." And they quote sage of great authority, Shul, who says that. And they respond, Rabbi Yehuda responds to them, says, you're making a mistake. The halacha is not like Rav Mona. And that which Shmuel said that would seem to indicate that the law is like that you would make hamotzi, that's only when you are kovea seuda, which means you establish a meal around these, in this case, which is lachmanis, this mizonos bread. But if you don't make a real meal out of it, you do not make hamotzi, and you don't make berachos hamazon, you'd make mizonos and alamechia. So what is Pasuk bkisnin? So there's three opinions about what it is. Again, my memory is not great. It's getting worse every day. But there's three opinions amongst the Rishonim. And the truth is you could subdivide some of the opinions, so it could turn it out to more than just three things. One opinion, it's in Rashi, it was some type of parched grains and maybe nuts that were good for your health. I don't know, maybe they helped your heart, I think Rashi said, something like that. So it was kind of like, I'm trying to think, I don't know, I don't know what it is. Something that helped your heart. And it was put into a dough, and it was eaten with, these things were eaten together, so that it was like a mix of a lot of things. And there might actually, according to Rashi, the problem might actually be is that you're never really eating the shir achila. You're not really eating the amount of actual bread because there's so many other things in it. I believe that's kind of what Rashi seems to indicate, although there's a discussion about what Rashi really means. But that's one opinion. Another opinion is bkisnin means a pocket, so it would mean like something like a pie, meaning that it's actually like bread, but there's a filler inside of it. A third opinion, it's like crackers. But if you look closely into these three opinions, you could subdivide them a lot. So that's just a general principle. And the Shulchan Aruch paskins, he says, since it's safek brachos lahakel, which is a good question. What do you mean? Which you generally, he doesn't use safek brachos lahakel. I think he says, since it's midrabanan, which means it's rabbinic, we could be lenient and say all three of these opinions are considered Pasuk bkisnin. We could have a whole conversation of why is it rabbinic? Isn't berachot hamazon the oraisa? And you could then potentially answer, the idea of a grace after meals may be da'oraisa, but the actual way you do it, whether it's the ala michya versus the birchat hamazon, that may not necessarily be da'oraisa. That's a little complicated. I don't want to get into that. It's not really the subject here, so I don't want to get into that. That's a sidebar. At some later point, we can get into that. But the bottom line is that what's happened is there's a whole industry of Mazonos bread. So if you go into a place like Crown Heights or Borough Park, you can go to the kosher store and they'll sell sandwiches on challah rolls and they'll say Mazonos. They'll sell bagels and they'll have these little round, like, kind of indentations on the bottom of it, so you could tell it's not a real bagel, it's a Mazonos bagel. What makes these things Mazonos bread, Mazonos bagels? Apple juice. But the truth is that really pasa bkisnin? Does the apple juice make it to be like, oh, by the way, one of the opinions was cake is like pasa bkisnin. I said there's three with variations on the three. So within that three, the framework of three, one of them is cake. One of them also, what wouldn't be in pasa bkisnin would be like a mushy cereal. Like you have a cereal, even though it's a grain cereal, that's not pasa bkisnin. Nobody's, even if you're having 20, bowls of cereal that are based on a grain, nobody considers that pasa bkisnin. It's got to have some mamashut to it, something like a cookie at least. It's a good question. I don't know if people would consider a cookie a pasa bkisnin, but definitely like a croissant would be a pasa bkisnin, even though it's like bread, but it's very flaky and oily, and it's not regular bread. It's a croissant. I mean, it's delicious. It's got a bready element to it, but it's not bread. It's a croissant. Pizza is pasa bkisnin because some people say, no, it's just bread with cheese on top. But the truth is you make it together. So the cheese and the sauce are very much they go into the bread. They don't have to go through and through the bread, but even when I eat pizza and I tear the cheese off, and then I want to eat, and I say, I'm not going to eat the crust, and then I'm not going to eat the bottom of the pizza. But then I have a bite of the bottom of the pizza. It's delicious because A, it's carbs, and carbs are delicious, and B, it's got the juice of the cheese and the tomato sauce in it. So it really isn't bread with cheese on it. It's pizza. It's its own thing. It is pasa bkisnin. Again, of course, like everything else, there's a debate about pizza, but I believe it's Moshe that says one slice of pizza and even two slices of pizza would follow under the category of pasa bkisnin. Since you're not kovei suda, you're not making a meal out of it. Most people have a slice or two of pizza. It's not a meal per se. It's a snack. It's a delicious snack. If you're sitting down, you're having three or more, then you would make a hamotzi because that would be kovei suda. So that's a little bit about pasa bkisnin. And then there's a whole question about, like, what if you're at a smorgasbord and you have a little mazonos, you have a cracker. So the Aruch HaShulchan says, l'chayra, seemingly, the whole smorgasbord becomes part of a meal that you would count all of the different side dishes that you're taking a little bit of. You took a cracker, and then you go to the station, and they give you corned beef and turkey, and you eat all of that, and then you go and you have some sushi, and you keep eating, and then you go to and you have mixed vegetables with Asian chicken in it. So the Aruch HaShulchan points out that might be l'chayra being kovei suda, and the Aruch HaShulchan himself. It's very disturbing, but he's like, oh, we got to find a way to answer this because everyone goes to the smorgasbord. They have a mazonos. Nobody's making a mitzi. I mean, maybe there's somebody, but I've never seen it. Actually, now they started having washing stations at even smorgasbord because there are big Talmud Chacham around. They might have read the Aruch HaShulchan, and they're going to wash on a dafka on something that is for sure hamitzi and cover all the shilas. That's always a good way. People want to be machmer, tabel le'am bracha, they should go wash an amotzi and fulfill their obligation. But there's a lot of different reasons why we're not so machmer, or we could at least be malamet spus from the people who don't have these stringencies. One is perhaps the very nature of going to a shmorgasborg is you're not sitting down. So it doesn't matter how much you eat. It doesn't count if you're standing. I mean, psychologically, because you have to understand, a big part of brachos is psychology. A big part of Torah, a big part of halacha is psychology. We're trying to understand the mind of the person making what's considered kovei suda. Is it that's the Gemara? The story of Rav Nachman and Rav Huna is really about this question, because Rav Huna is eating and eating and eating like there's no tomorrow, and Rav Nachman says it doesn't matter that you could keep eating and it's nothing to you. Other people, normal people, eat anything near you, and that's considered kviya suda, meaning we don't allow your individual mind. Or do we? Who's koveya what a suda is? Is it you, or is it the world? That's the first question that's asked on Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph, and it's a question that will run through this daf as it does many other dafim. In this daf, it will particularly be more about when do you finish a meal? When is a meal over? And that has to do with the das, with the mindset of the person or the mindset of the group, and it's going to really balance those two out and discuss that at great length. It's fascinating in terms of psychology, because you could learn this Gemara over. There's going to be a lot of history, a lot of psychology in this page of Gemara. So that's number 2, the pizza, the cake, the crackers, the shmorgasborg, the pasaba bkisnin. And number 3 is what I just mentioned, your mind versus groupthink. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what am I talking about, your mind versus groupthink. So let's say you're part of a group, and in your mind you've eaten all that you can eat, and in your own mind you're telling yourself, I'm done, I can't eat anymore, and I'm not going to. I'm benching. I mean, I don't know if everyone else is benching, so halachically, many times you should wait for the group to bench together to be part of the zimun. Okay, so I'll sit quietly, but I'm done. What do we say? Because when you wash, you're washing for a couple things. You're washing so that you can make hamotzi. And that's one thing. And the rabbis instituted that. That's like a throwback to the laws of Tumah and Tahara. So we keep that in play a little bit through washing until Yadayim. Okay, great. The second thing you're doing is you're making a bracha of hamotzi. The hamotzi is a signifier of the meal as a whole. So as long as you are within the space internally of the meal as a whole, then you're good. Everything is covered, unless the exceptions are we just learned wine during the week and dessert all the time, even on Shabbos. And again, in the Rishonim and even in the Gemara, there's other exceptions, but they don't really apply to our eating style today or the psak halacha of today. So those are the 2 exceptions. Otherwise, the meal includes everything. But what happens when you really decide you're benching? And that's the question. When is deciding final? When does the person's mind be koveya, establish a clear delineation that the meal is over? Because once the meal is over, it's no longer covered. You removed yourself from that blessing that covered the meal, because the meal is now over for you. So for example, let's say, for argument's sake, I did bench, right? And then I said, oh, you know what? I want a cookie. I really, I had a fruit dessert, but a cookie, can't be replaced by fruit. So I'm going to go and I'm going to eat the cookie without a bracha? No. Even during the meal, a cookie is like a dessert. A dessert is like something delicious, but it's not there to fill you up. It's there just for its pure deliciousness. Just because it's delicious, the rabbi said, you know what, that's not the meal. That's something else. That's not boim machmas asuda. That's not coming per se to fill you up. That's coming because you have a taiva to have something sweet. Okay, good. Make a bracha on it. You want to have something after the meal? Even if you have to make a bracha. Not only that, the Gemara tells us that once you really decide, whatever that really is, and the Gemara has 3 different opinions about it, once you decide when, and the rabbis concur with your decision that that's a real decision, that the end of the meal is here, then you have to make a new bracha. According to Tosfos, not only that, you'd have to, let's say you wanted to continue, you change your mind back to wanting to continue to eat, you'd have to go and wash your hands again, because washing the hands is connected to the whole consciousness of eating a meal. And once your consciousness is over for that meal, you have to start all over again. That doesn't mean everyone holds like Tosfos, but that's Tosfos' opinion. By the way, from this we could deduce the opposite. This is quoted in the Rambam, which is, let's say I know that I want to eat all day. So I wash at 10 a.m. and I say, this is going to be a meal. I'm going to watch my hands to make sure I don't touch dirty things or things that would require me to rewash Netilas Yadayim for Hamotzi. And I'm going to make this 10 a.m. washing of the hands at Hamotzi to cover the entire day. At 10 p.m., I'm going to go to the Carlebach Shul for Mariv. I'm going to bench by 10 p.m. But everything in between today is all going to be under this mindset of my meal. It works. It works. But just like it works when I have it in mind, it also works the opposite. Once my mind stops and says I'm no longer eating. So let's go through these different opinions. And again, as I mentioned before, this is all about psychology. This is very much about the power of the mind, of when is your individual power removed from you because you're in a group, right? Like if you want to understand the dynamics right now, what's going on in America with the elections and the Republicans and the Democrats and how they understand science or what an election means or what stealing an election is. Is it a real thing? Don't bother, don't talk to even your best friend. Don't bother talking to them as an individual. They are no longer an individual. There's very few people in the United States of America who are not part of a group think right now. So their mind is temporarily suspended in that particular area to go along with the way the group thinks. Basically, we're all part of a cult. We're all part of a cult. Every time you join a group, the power of the group has a cult-like element that removes certain parts of your judgment for good and for bad. It's also what, from, I guess, an evolutionary perspective, allows us to form a group and allows us to go to battle with another group, is that we suspend certain individual judgments for the sake of the group. Okay, my politics, I'm sorry I brought that up. I'm sorry I'm talking about group thinking, but that is what the Gemara is talking about. So let's take a look at what the Gemara says. Okay, the Gemara says the following. They used to have bread throughout the meal. So if they remove the bread from the table, although today the custom is to even leave the bread on when you're benching, but back then that was the custom. So they would remove the bread, and one opinion was, once that happened, you can't eat anymore. I believe that's Rav Papa. But here's the story of Rav and Reb Zera. They visited the Reish Galusa. The Reish Galusa is the exilarch. It's like the governor a very powerful figure in the Talmudic times that was granted authority by the government. And sometimes they weren't always 100% kosher, but often they were. Often there was a tension between them and the rabbis. They had their favorite rabbi, and that was the rabbi that either they kind of respected, or they had a rabbi that they always would fight with, or something in between. So they were at the home of this governor. It's not clear where the governor was. He definitely wasn't sitting with them, but it was his home. And Rava was eating, and Reb Zera stopped eating. Actually, what happened is they took the table away from them. They used to eat at these little tables, right? So they take the tables away from them, and that's symbolic of the meal is over. And then they brought out, surprise, surprise, like they wanted to say, we're over the top here, here's food for you, even though you thought it was finished. And one of the rabbis said, great, he started eating, he didn't wash, he didn't make another bracha, he just ate it. And the other rabbi abstained from eating because in his own mind, he says, well, isn't the rule that once you finish the meal, you formally finish, they took the tables away, so you can't eat again without a bracha, and according to Tosas, you'd have to go wash again even. So Rava said to Reb Zera was the one who stopped, Anan ataka de Reish Galusa samchinan. We are dependent on the table of the Rosh Galusa, which means what? When you are part of a group, you take your brain, you check it at the door because you no longer have your own brain. And I say brain, you have a brain, you could think, but we learned, for example, in the Torah reading today, in the Chumash of today, of Chayei Sarah, that Abraham beseeches the people to be able to bury his wife, the Bnei Ches, and he says the words, Im yesh es nafshechem likvar es mesim elfanei. If it is within your souls. What does that mean? It's in your souls. So Rashi says, Ritzonchem, your will. So basically what I'm saying to check your brain at the door is you check your will brain. Your will of when this meal is over is not when you want it to be over. You are a guest. You are not the host. So the idea here is when you are part of a group and you're not the leader of the group in terms of it being a dinner party and you're at somebody else's home, you're at somebody else's place, then your intention or even what the servants did does not matter. It's what the head of the household, in this case the Reish Galusa. Okay, so that's a very important principle. The Gemara is going to ultimately say that it's takif. That's basically what I wanted to say for number 3. And for number 4, number 3 is going to continue in number 5, actually. So I'll just give you a hint, and then I'm going to come back to it and elaborate more on it specifically. Number 5, the Gemara's ultimate answer is going to be Takef l'netila bracha, which means the way we do it is you want to know when the meal is over when you wash your hands. They wash mayim achronim, it's called, because they had the melech Sodomus, this salt of Sodom. We just learned to the parsha about the salt of Sodom being salty, but it also was supposedly dangerous if you wiped your eye with it. So you'd wash your hands after the meal. And take if l'netila after that, that's really when you're going to bench. So before you do that, you could always, you say, we're finished. It doesn't mean anything. How many times do you say you're finished and you're not finished when it comes to food? Food is endless. So unless you actually wash your hands, or even more, you say, let's say some people don't do, they don't do that because we don't have melech Sodomus anymore. So there's some people who are not so makbid on that anymore. So then they'd have to say, Rabosai Mevel Benchen. They said, the formal declaration of let's bench. It can't even be one of the guests saying it's time to bench, because the guest is a guest. The guest, again, the same thing, doesn't get to decide when to bench. So that's number 5. But let's go back to number 4, which is, actually I did number 4. the boss. Ataka deresh galusach semchinan. So we did that already. But I just want to add in one concept into there, which is the afikomen. What happens if you say Rabbi Sai on the night of Pesach and you say, uh-oh, we forgot to eat the afikomen? Do you say, oh, too bad, you have to bench? Or do you say, no, since afikomen is a mitzvah, once something is a mitzvah, the whole mindset of the Suda of Pesach night is bounded by that obligation to eat the afikomen. So it doesn't matter that you said Rabosai. The Rabosai is not final because you still have to do the mitzvah of the afikomen, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is ultimately your balabas. So that's what Tosfos points out. So that's number 4. Number 5 is what we were just talked about that there are 3 semichas. There are 3 things that we say they're right next to each other. What are the 3 things? So one of them is the netila, the after Mayim Achronim, you do birchot hamazon. Another is you do smicha by a carbon before you slaughter the offering. And the third thing, which is important, I want to talk about for a moment, is tekef legeula tefillah, which is right next to asking God to redeem us, to save us. We pray. We do the tefillah, and we learned a lot about that earlier in the first, and it was mostly in the first chapter. Is what does it say? Kol hasamach l'il tefillah. It says many. First, maybe second as well. The power of being samach geula l'tefillah is basically, I think Rashi says, imagine you knock at the door and you don't wait for the person to answer, and when the person answers, they're no longer there. So when geula is like not asking for geula is like knocking on the door at really wanting HaKadosh Baruch Hu to open the door for us. And tefillah is like standing in His presence. So they come together, and there's a lot of great stuff on that and why it's so important. But there's also a lot on like a lot of people, a lot of chazanim won't say Ga'al Yisrael out loud, because then people will say Amain, and that'll be considered an interruption. But even if you did say Amain, it's not the end of the world, because there are poskim that say it's not such a bad thing. But the truth is that most people are noeg to say the end of that bracha silently, so people go straight into Shmon Esrei. And even the fact that we say Hashem Sfasai Tiftach and other things by Marv, there's a whole Gemara discussing how we can do that, since the Geula and Tefillah have to be so close together. That's that the Kamas Chazal included those things. So that's number 5. Number 6 is, let's talk about the Roman occupation of Palestine. They occupied Israel and they called it Palestine. The reason why Israel had a name Palestine has nothing to do, absolute zero to do with what's called the Palestinian people today. There's no connection between Palestinian people today and the actual place that was the original name Palestine. Palestine was given to the best of my knowledge. I'm not a historian, so don't take my word for it. But based on the limited amount of research that I have done, Palestine was the name that the Roman occupiers gave the land of Israel, because they wanted to take away some of its power of the local people. So, and at that time you have to understand, just like today, when America, for example, doesn't occupy Israel, but it's a superpower, so it has an influence culturally, militarily, economically. So when you go to Tel Aviv, you think you're going to like South Beach or Hollywood. It's culturally very similar to the United States. In fact, I want to say something like when you go to Tel Aviv, you get a little bit. I'm a religious guy, So I get along with everyone. I'm not trying to make use the religious superiority, but there's also some sentiment from some people, Chilonim, against not all, but some people have like an attitude about religious people, for good reason for some of them, because they get the attitude from the religious people, and there's a whole conflict going on that I don't want to get into. But sometimes when I go there, and it's just interesting because having been raised in Berkeley, California, where the new vice president is from, Kamala Harris, went to school in Berkeley, and then Melrose in Los Angeles, and knowing movie stars just because they lived in the neighborhood, and some would come over for Shabbos dinner or to the Shul I went to. And then continuing my whole life living in interesting places, whether it was time spent in Northern California, Santa Cruz, San Francisco, here now on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and rubbing shoulders with the Manhattanites that consider themselves the cultural elite, which is why we pay a lot of rent here. The rent is going to go back up here, my friends, because the snob factor of living in Manhattan is still very much a part of living in Manhattan. That's not going anywhere with COVID, without COVID. So Manhattan real estate, if you have money, put it into Manhattan real estate right now, because it's going to go way back up. It's just a matter of, a year or 2, 3. It's going to go way back up because there is no place in the country like Manhattan. So it's because of the snobbery, basically, of this kind of the elite, which is, by the way, why Trump won the first election, because he played on against that elitism, even though he's a New Yorker, but he managed to just, spin it the way he spun it to be a man of the people. But getting back to what that has to do with me in Tel Aviv, it's very simple. There in Tel Aviv, I'm also an American. So I'm also familiar with certain American trends and literature and ideas. Not that I'm the world's expert, I'm not a movie star or anything, but so when I see what's going on in Tel Aviv, I'm like, okay, that's cool, that's great, but we exported a lot of the stuff from Hollywood to you, so you're getting it secondhand. On the other hand, when I come as a religious person, it's the opposite. I come as this is the source. I'm looking to receive. I am the student. In the secular world, I'm the teacher because I'm coming from the source. I'm telling you what's the trend here right now. But as a religious person, I'm receiving, because in Eretz Yisrael, they're just, other than Rav Moshe and Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rabbi Soloveitchik, those three, they were like the Gadol Hador even till today. But living now, we had Rav Dovid Feinstein, we have the Feinsteins, but other than that, we don't have in the United States, we don't have the Gedolim the way they had it in before, when Rav Moshe was alive and the Rebbe was alive. So I go to Eretz Yisrael to receive. But back then, in the time of the Mishnah, you still felt the presence of the Roman occupation, and therefore, just like today, we're talking about culturally Tel Aviv today, and that's how I got into this whole sidebar about Hollywood, growing up in Hollywood, and what it's like visiting secular people in Tel Aviv. That's how it was back then. Very much the cultural influences were Roman. So, for example, if you look up, how did the Romans eat? Here's how they ate. They ate multiple courses. It was a dinner that would start early and end late. There was a lot of wine drunk in it. There were different things that were brought out. There were lots of appetizers and main courses and desserts. And it was very lavish, and there were a lot of stages in it. It was very extended. So when you learn the Mishnah on Mem Beis Amud Aleph, going into the next page as well, it's a reflection of that reality. So here's what it says. Berach al hayayin shlofnei hamazon, Pater es hayayin shel achar hamazon. Let's say you had, when would they start drinking? Before they sat down to eat. They'd bring them cocktails, just like today. They have a cocktail hour. They'd have a cocktail hour. They'd give them a drink. They'd give them wine in the beginning. Maybe there'd be like, what do they have? Today they have salty nuts to make you want to have more drinks at the bar. They'd have a little something, but it wasn't real food yet. It wasn't food to be satisfied for your hunger. It was just for the wine. The wine was the first thing you did. So if you made the bracha for the wine before you're actually eating, that would cover the wine even after, because guess what? After you finish eating, they'd bring out more wine. The port, the after dinner wines, they would come out. So once you made the bracha before, that would cover the wine after, because it's all part of one hemshech, one continuation of wine that you're going to be drinking. Berach al parperes lefnei hamazon, pater al parperes la'achar hamazon. They would serve certain dishes. I think Rashi says parperes might be like certain type of light fowl that they would serve, and spicy vegetables that they would serve. So you'd eat that as an appetizer before you necessarily had the actual main course. But you made a bracha on that, so that would cover. You would have maybe another set of appetizers after the main course as well. So that bracha would cover that. Berach al pas pater parperes. If you make a bracha on the bread, that covers all of those, the meats and the sides, all of the different vegetable things are all covered in that. Ala parperes. Let's say you made the bracha on some of the meat or chicken or some of these sides, then lo pater es hapas, that doesn't cover the bread. Okay, so that's what the Mishnah says. Comes the Gemara, and that's number 5, and number 6. The Gemara we're going to do number 7, how they ate in the time of the Gemara and also today, based on the Yerushalmi and Tosfos. So the Yerushalmi, which I don't have in front of me, and I have a terrible memory, but I did do it a few weeks ago because I've been on too long of a break for this thing. The Yerushalmi is going to say that the Gemara does not follow the Mishnah. Which I found very interesting. I thought, I'm about to tell you what the Gemara says. I thought the Gemara interprets the Mishnah, but according to the Yerushalmi, no, they argue. They have a different, not that so much they argue. Here's a much better thing than they argue. They had a different setup. They didn't eat in the same way, so the law didn't change because it changed. The reality changed and the law changed with the reality. And let me explain to you what I'm talking about. So this is Nogei L'Maisa, which means that this makes a difference today. So Rabbi Barachana, this is towards the top of Mem Beis Amud Beis, says the following. Talking about wine. The Mishnah said that once you make the bracha on wine, that covers the wine. You don't have to make a bracha every time you bring out another glass of wine. You bring out dessert wine. It's not dessert. It's wine. Wine is wine is wine. You make one hagafen, that covers all the wine. Comes this rabbi and says, no. That's on Shabbos. True. Let's say Shabbos. You make Kiddush. Once you make Kiddush, which includes a hagafen on the Kiddush wine, that covers any wine you're going to have at dinner or lunch. That's covered. But during the week, you have to make a bracha every time you bring in you get a refill, you get a new glass, you got to make a new bracha. What's the reason for that? Because on Shabbos, and I'd say by Yantif also, yeah, actually the Gemara says Shabbos and Yantif. And a few other times. And a person comes out of a Beis HaMerchatz, or they had bloodletting. And then the person makes could be a suda on the wine. It's like the wine is very important. But on a weeknight, to have a lot of wine, that's not normal. This goes with the psychology of the person who's eating or drinking, or the community that you're in. You're usually going to have a cup of wine during dinner. You're going to have 3 cups. That's not the norm. Shabbos, it might be the norm, but not on a regular weeknight. And therefore, you have to make a bracha each time you have a cup of wine. Comes the Yerushalmi and says that the Bavli is not like the Mishnah. And the way I understand it is not that the Bavli doesn't hold like the Mishnah. No, they had a different reality. The Roman influence on Israel, which the Roman occupiers called Palestine, made it that the rabbis in the Mishnah had wine like the Romans throughout the meal. It wasn't like, oh, here's a cup of wine, and, oh, you know what? Let's have a second cup. No. It was normal to have multiple cups of wine. That's how the Yerushalmi learns our Mishnah. Yerushalmi doesn't agree with the Bavli, but I think it's a mitzias. It's an actual difference. The Babylonians didn't agree in their culture with the Mishnah. It's not that they argued halachically. If they would have lived in the time of the Mishnah, according to the way the Yerushalmi understood, they would have made one bracha even during the week for 1 cup of wine, and it would have covered all the subsequent cups, because that's the Roman way of drinking. And Tosfos, following this idea that it has to do with the way we eat today. Brachos are influenced by the style of eating that we eat in today. So, for example, in a similar vein, Tosfos says, the Gemara says that who gets to make a bracha for everyone, like a hamotzi to be yotze everyone. Or likewise to lead the benching, not just the zimun, but to actually say berachas mazon out loud, and everybody will listen, answer Amain at the end of each bracha, and everyone who listens will have automatically fulfilled their obligation. Only hesebu, when they do haseba, when they recline. Comes Tosfos and says, we don't recline it. Reclining was a Roman thing. Or maybe they did it even in the time of the Gemara. But in Europe, nobody's reclining for any dinner anymore. So therefore, what is the equivalent of reclining that one person could make hamotzi for everyone in the household? When you sit down at a table. As opposed to one person sitting on the couch, another person going to this room, another person going to that room. Today, when we eat without eating at the table, then we can't make a bracha for the other members of the household or bench for the other members of the household, because that's not sitting together. So that's the psychology of sitting together. So that's number 8, the Bavli, Yerushalmi, and Tosfos. And number 9 is wine today. So here's a question. What is wine today? Do we poskin like the Bavli, which would say that every time you're having wine during a meal on a regular night or day for that matter, you make a bracha each time independently. Hamotzi doesn't cover it. That Hakol Mod and the Hamotzi doesn't cover it. That's a Feirush Gemara. There's no chiluk in that between a Tuesday or Wednesday. Shabbos, it's covered by the yain, because you have a bracha on yain on because of Kiddush. So the question becomes, do we just follow the Bavli? And the Rishonim and the Achronim say we do follow the Bavli. Because if there's a Achlokas Bavli and Yerushalmi, who do we follow? Generally, we follow the Bavli. Or do we say that we follow the Bavli? But the Bavli is just saying we changed it because it's no longer like the time of the Mishnah. That's the way that... In other words, is the Yerushalmi here a pirush on the Bavli? Or is it an astira to the Bavli? Is it an interpretation? Or is it in a contradiction? And I want to say this is not a davar pashut. If we become the type of people that we have multiple glasses of wine, if you're going to, let's say, an annual dinner, or a wedding, or a bar mitzvah, we know there's a waiter coming with, sir, would you like some wine, red or white, right? How many times are they going to come? If it's a good caterer, they're going to come every 10, they're going to come as soon as your glass is near empty. They'll be back. Which means what? that l'cha'ira, you don't have to make a bracha every time. It's, again, I think, Safek brachos l'hakel, I would argue and say that we could go back. Again, I'm not a paisek, definitely not a paisek kadosh. I don't know. If you follow the straight up Shulchan Aruch, you'd have to make hagafen every time. L'chara, that's still where we are. Why? Because the person, now you could get away with the semichas, with the doubts, by having the following thing in mind. When you make the first hagafen, you think, I'm going to have more, and it's all covered. If you have that in mind, then it becomes, then it includes, then that would open it up for the future wine. But if you don't have it in mind, if you just said hagafen without thinking about it, so then, l'char, you have to follow the Shulchan Aruch, and you have to make a separate bracha in every cup that you're served during the course of the dinner. So that's an interesting observation of what do we do, since the Yerushalmi might be a pirush on the Bavli, and since our norms may have changed since the Bavli and have gone more back to the time of the Mishnah. You understand the question? So the question, it's a very serious halachic question of where is wine today? And that leads me to the last thing, number 10. Our master, our teacher is gone. I want to eulogize a little bit of Dovid Feinstein. I was at a shiva house of somebody from the Lower East Side, and a certain businessman named Mr. Singer came into the shiva house, and he was telling stories. He said, you know, they say all these great things about Rav Moshe, but I know Reb Dovid. And he started describing a time where he was injured, and despite his injury, he was like bleeding. And instead of just focused on himself, he was still dealing with other people's problems. He said, and I could tell you, this is not a story, you know, like that they tell. I saw it with my own eyes. So Reb Dovid was somebody who was iber gegeben. He was given over to helping other Yidden with Torah, to just really be there for them, and to be a dugma chaya, to be a amazing example of what it is to be. Torah is kol kuli what he is. Torah and Yisrael. There's no difference when somebody gets to that level. The people and the Torah are the same, and it's a beautiful thing. And that's how the last story is that the Gemara is talking about this mindset that you have to be kovea seuda by reclining together, and that creates a bond, and that allows you to make berachos hamazon together, that one person can actually. Let's talk a little bit about number 9, because I didn't really do number 9, which is fulfilling other people's obligation for brachos. So I just wanted to say that there's this element of when you make a bracha for berachos hanenin, according to the Yerushalmi, you can't fulfill somebody's obligation to, let's say, make a bracha on a chocolate bar, because the benefit you're getting is real from a chocolate bar. So to hear somebody else's bracha is not good enough. You have to make your own bracha. So the idea of making hamotzi for the assembled people is an exception that breaks the rule, according to the Yerushalmi at least. And the reason for the exception is because when you gather to eat, so then the group sitting down to eat is koveya, that establishes that it's not just individuals that happen to be eating in proximity to each other, but it's a group of people eating. It changes the very nature of the eating, and therefore one person making the hamotzi or the berachos hamazon does fulfill the obligation. And that's something that we can explore also about tefillah as well. You can't pray for somebody else. I mean, you could pray for somebody else, but everyone has their own obligation to pray out as an individual. Yet, a chazan can be motzi the rabbim, can fulfill the community's obligation, especially when they didn't have sidurim and people didn't have ways to read and didn't know it by heart, by just simply answering Amain to the chazan shmon esrei. Why is that? Because the tzibur is koveya. That means the community, the communal aspect of the tefillah b'tzibur creates a new reality, which even though you're not davening yourself, it's as if, which is also the power of Amain. The Gemara tells us, not here, but it does tell us that let me see, that Amain says about Amain. Oh, so it's Gemara and Shavuos, Lamed Vav, that says, Amain bo ha'amanas dvarim, Amain bo kabbalas dvarim. When you say Amain, you're saying these you're accepting what's being said. It's as if you actually said it yourself. So that's the power of Amain. The argument can be made that even without, it's a little bit different than Shomea Ka'ona. The principle of listening is like, or listening is like you yourself said it. Because by saying Amen, even if you didn't hear the whole bracha from beginning to end, you just heard the end of it, and you said Amen, you are verifying what the chazan said or what the person said, and it's as if you actually said it, even though you didn't. Getting back to the final one, number 10, our master, our teacher is gone. That's the story when they were traveling back from burying their teacher Rav, and they stopped. They said, "We're going to this town. When we get there, let's stop and eat." And there's a question is, they're on the way, so they didn't have time to set up a proper eating with reclining. And usually we said before, reclining is what establishes a community, at least in the Talmudic times. Tosfos points out that now it's sitting at a table. But back then that wasn't the way, it was by reclining. Since they didn't recline, they weren't sure. They had designated a place before they got there. They didn't just like haphazardly happen to eat without planning it. They planned it a little bit in advance. But there was no reclining, so they didn't know whether one person could bench on the behalf of all of them, and the others would just answer Amen. And then they cried out and they said, "Woe!" One of the rabbis did a second kriya. This is the top of Mem Gimel Amud Aleph. I'm going over a little bit because it's the end of the story. He did a second tearing. And he said, "Nach nashe de Rav, ubirchas mezayna legaminan." Our master has left us, and we don't even know the laws of how to make a birchas hamazon, how to bench after a meal. Until Ada Asahu Saba, Ramalu Masnisan Abraisa Vishanilu Kibin Aminezo Benechalach Mabarch Palan Kesebudami. Till an old man came and he showed that there was a contradiction between a Mishnah and a Brisa, and he reconciled it by saying, once you say that let's go, we'll stop at that place and eat, it's as if they reclined and they could have a communal benching. But this is the power of the Gadol Hador, the Posek Hador, Reb Dovid Feinstein, to be able to help us to know how to do Birchas Hamazon, how to know the laws of the bracha on each thing that we eat, to sanctify our every moment, not just the biggest questions in life, like life and death, that he was able to answer those questions, but even just when to bench and how to bench and what bracha to make. That's what the Gemara says, that if you want to know what bracha to make, go to a chacham. We need to have chachamim to be able to help our generation so that we know what we're doing. They're the Eidei Ha'eda, they're the eyes of our generation. Reb Dovid was our eyes and our ears, and without him there's a big hole in our hearts that we don't have a great person to turn to for big and small. And I hope that we can learn a little extra in his memory. Zecher Tzadik Levracha, his memory should be for a bracha.